Margaret Whitmore believed houses had souls. Not ghosts. Not spirits. Memories. And the white colonial at the end of Maple Ridge Drive in Columbus had a soul built from 37 years of living. She stood at the front window that October morning, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, Daniel's mug, and watched the maple leaves scatter across the yard. Daniel had planted that maple tree the year Michael started kindergarten. "Roots matter," he'd said while digging the hole. "If the roots are strong, nothing can push it over." Margaret wondered now if that was still true. 5 years after Daniel's sudden heart attack, loneliness began pressing in on Margaret like winter frost. Michael started calling more often. "Mom, it doesn't make sense for you to live alone in such a big house." "I manage just fine," she would reply. But she didn't mention the long evenings. Or the silence at dinner. When Michael and his wife Emily suggested moving in temporarily, it sounded almost comforting. "We can help with maintenance," Emily said brightly during their visit from Chicago. "You shouldn't be worrying about repairs at your age." At your age. The phrase stung, though Emily's smile was perfectly polished. Margaret told herself she was being sensitive. They moved in that spring. At first, it was small things. The couch shifted closer to the television. The floral curtains Daniel had chosen were replaced with gray panels. "The house needs to feel modern," Emily said. Margaret tried to adapt. But then came the kitchen. Margaret walked in one afternoon and stopped short. Her spice rack, alphabetized by Daniel decades ago, was gone. The antique bread box her mother gave her had disappeared. And Daniel's mug sat inside a cardboard box labeled "Donate." Margaret's breath caught. She lifted it carefully. "That's clutter," Emily said lightly from behind her. "We're simplifying." Simplifying. Margaret carried the mug upstairs and placed it inside her bedroom closet, behind winter sweaters. For safekeeping. 3 months later, the electric bill never arrived on the hallway table. Margaret searched twice. "Oh, I switched everything to online billing," Emily explained casually over coffee. "I handle it now." "You handle it?" Margaret repeated. "It's easier. You shouldn't stress about finances." Margaret had paid every mortgage payment on time for 3 decades. She had balanced checkbooks before Emily learned multiplication. Still, she nodded. Because arguing felt exhausting. It happened slowly, so slowly that Margaret almost doubted herself. Emily began saying, "When we bought this house." Margaret corrected her once. "You didn't buy this house." Emily's smile tightened. "Well, when we live here." Michael always avoided eye contact during these exchanges. At dinner one evening, Emily placed a glossy brochure on the table. "Look how beautiful this is," she said sweetly. It was a retirement community outside Cincinnati. Landscaped gardens. Smiling gray-haired couples. Michael cleared his throat. "Just something to think about, Mom." Margaret folded the brochure neatly. "I am not leaving my home." Silence settled over the table like dust. 2 weeks later, Margaret found a real estate agent's card near the fruit bowl. When she asked Michael about it, he rubbed his forehead. "Emily's just exploring options." "For what?" Margaret asked quietly. He didn't answer. That was worse than arguing. Daniel's old oak desk sat in the study, exactly where it had been for 25 years. Inside the bottom drawer were the original deed, insurance documents, tax records, the mortgage release letter. Margaret opened it one Tuesday morning. The deed was missing. Her heartbeat began to pound in her ears. She searched again. Empty. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Emily appeared, calm as ever. "Oh, I borrowed that." "For what?" "To make copies." "For estate planning." Margaret stared at her. "I didn't ask for estate planning." Emily's expression never wavered. "We're just thinking ahead." "We." Margaret suddenly felt like a guest in her own home. The next morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She drove downtown to speak to her banker, a man who had known Daniel. The branch of Chase Bank sat on High Street, unchanged. Mr. Peterson frowned as he reviewed her account. "Mrs. Whitmore, there have been recent authorization requests." "Authorization?" she whispered. "Yes. About transferring the property into a shared family trust." Margaret's blood ran cold. "I did not approve that." Mr. Peterson adjusted his glasses. "There's paperwork submitted with your signature." Margaret felt the room tilt. "I never signed anything." He slid a copy across the desk. It looked like her signature. But the curve of the M was wrong. Subtle, but wrong. That evening, Margaret placed the copied document on the dining table. Michael and Emily sat across from her. "Who signed this?" she asked. Emily didn't flinch. "You did." "I did not." Michael looked back and forth between them. "Mom, maybe you forgot?" "Forgot?" Margaret stood slowly. "I may be aging. I may be slower. But I am not confused." Her voice shook, not with weakness but fury. Emily leaned back in her chair. "We were trying to protect the house from probate complications." "By forging my name?" Margaret demanded. Silence. And in that silence, something inside Margaret hardened. That night, she locked her bedroom door. For the first time in her own home, she took out Daniel's mug and sat on the edge of the bed. "Roots matter," Daniel had said. Margaret wiped her tears. Yes, roots mattered, and she was not a fragile branch to be cut away. The next morning, she called a property attorney in Cleveland. Her voice was steady. "I believe my daughter-in-law is attempting to take my home." There was a pause on the line. "Then let's make sure she doesn't." The morning Margaret Whitmore called the attorney in Cleveland, her voice did not tremble. It surprised even her. "I need help," she said plainly. "Someone tried to transfer my house into a trust without my consent." There was a pause on the other end. "My name is Rebecca Lawson," the woman replied. "I handle property fraud and elder financial exploitation cases. Can you come in tomorrow?" Margaret glanced at the hallway outside her bedroom door. She could hear Emily's heels clicking across hardwood downstairs. "Yes," Margaret said. "I'll be there." The next morning, Margaret left before sunrise. She told Michael she had a doctor's appointment. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her heart did feel sick. The highway stretched gray and endless between Columbus and Cleveland. Cornfields blurred past her windshield. She had driven this road decades earlier for family trips, vacations, college visits. Now she drove it to protect her home. When she reached downtown Cleveland, the wind off Lake Erie cut through her coat as she stepped toward a brick office building with brass lettering on the door. Lawson and Myers, Property and Estate Law. Margaret squared her shoulders and entered. Rebecca Lawson was younger than Margaret expected, mid-40s, sharp eyes, calm presence. She did not smile politely the way Emily did. She listened. Really listened. Margaret explained everything. The missing deed. The online banking changes. The trust paperwork. The signature that wasn't hers. Rebecca examined the copied document under a magnifying glass. "This is not a natural signature," she said. "The pressure points are inconsistent. And this filing was submitted electronically." Margaret's pulse quickened. "So it's fraud?" Rebecca met her gaze. "Yes. And potentially a felony." The word felt heavy in the air. Felony. Emily in handcuffs? Michael dragged into court? Margaret felt both vindicated and shattered at once. Rebecca turned her computer screen toward Margaret. "This trust filing was recorded with the county clerk in Franklin County 3 weeks ago." Margaret's mouth went dry. "She didn't even tell me." Rebecca nodded. "There's more. The trust lists all 3 of you as co-managers, but designates survivorship rights to your son and daughter-in-law." "What does that mean?" "It means if something happens to you, they automatically assume full ownership. No probate. No dispute." Margaret leaned back in her chair. It wasn't planning. It was positioning. Rebecca made another call. By afternoon, they were sitting with a forensic accountant. Numbers appeared across spreadsheets. Margaret learned something she had never imagined. Emily had significant credit card debt from Chicago. Private loans. Overdue balances. "She applied for a home equity line of credit against your property," the accountant said. Margaret felt her hands go cold. "They were going to borrow against my house?" Rebecca nodded grimly. "But it was flagged because your identification verification didn't fully clear. That may have saved you." "Saved? By accident." That evening, Margaret returned home to Maple Ridge Drive. Emily greeted her in the kitchen. "How was your appointment?" Margaret forced a small smile. "Routine." That night at dinner, Margaret did something she had never done before. She placed her phone quietly in her cardigan pocket. Recording. When the conversation drifted to finances, Emily spoke casually. "We should really finalize the trust paperwork soon." "It's already started." Margaret's heartbeat pounded. "Started how?" Emily waved her fork dismissively. "Oh, I handled most of it already. You signed, remember?" Margaret's voice stayed steady. "I don't remember signing." Emily's smile thinned. "Well, you did." The room felt tight. Michael stared at his plate. Margaret let the silence stretch. Then she asked softly, "And if I refused?" Emily didn't hesitate. It would complicate things. The recording captured every word. Later that night, Michael knocked on Margaret's bedroom door. "Mom, are you okay?" She looked at her son. The boy she had rocked through fevers, helped with homework, cheered at baseball games. "Did you know?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "I knew she was setting up a trust. I didn't know about any signature issues." "Did you ask?" He didn't answer. Margaret's voice broke for the first time. "This house is not an investment strategy, Michael. It is my life." He sat down heavily. "We're drowning in debt, Mom." There it was. The truth. Emily's truth. Michael's weakness. Margaret closed her eyes. "So you thought taking my house would save you?" His silence was answer enough. The next day, Rebecca called. "I need you to come back to Cleveland. We're filing an emergency injunction." Margaret packed a small overnight bag. She didn't tell Emily. When she arrived at Lawson and Myers, Rebecca laid out the plan. File fraud charges. Freeze any property transfers. Notify the bank. Record a protective notice with the county clerk. "You have every right to press criminal charges," Rebecca said firmly. Margaret stared out the office window at Lake Erie. Criminal charges meant court. Public records. Michael implicated. Her grandson, sweet 8-year-old Noah, caught in the middle. Margaret's chest tightened. "Is there another way?" she asked. Rebecca folded her hands. "There is always negotiation. But only if they're willing." Margaret thought of Emily's calm smile. Willing? Unlikely. Margaret did not warn them. She returned home that Friday afternoon with official documents in her purse. Emily was in the living room, laptop open. "We need to talk," Margaret said. Michael came downstairs slowly. Margaret laid the injunction papers on the coffee table. Emily's expression flickered for the first time. "What is this?" "A court order," Margaret said evenly. "Freezing any transfer or loan against this property." Michael paled. Emily stood. "You went behind our backs?" Margaret's voice did not rise. "This is my house. You went behind mine." Silence. Then Emily's composure cracked. "You're overreacting. We were trying to protect our future." "By forging my name?" Margaret asked calmly. Emily didn't answer. But her silence was louder than any confession. That night, something changed in the house. The air felt different. Emily stayed in her bedroom. Michael avoided Margaret's eyes. Margaret sat alone at Daniel's desk and placed the original deed back inside the drawer, now protected under legal watch. She felt tired, but not defeated. For the first time in months, she felt rooted again. The following week, Rebecca called with unexpected news. "There's been another development." Margaret gripped the phone. "What now?" "The trust filing wasn't only submitted with your forged signature." A pause. "It was notarized." Margaret frowned. "I never met with a notary." Rebecca's voice sharpened. "Exactly. That meant someone had falsely notarized a fraudulent document. Which meant this wasn't just family manipulation. It was a wider crime. And someone else was involved." Margaret looked around her quiet bedroom. The walls that had witnessed birthdays, Christmas mornings, Daniel's laughter. This was no longer just about control. It was about survival. And someone had underestimated her. Margaret had always believed that truth surfaced slowly, like something buried under soil that eventually pushed toward daylight. But this truth was rising fast. Too fast. The morning after Rebecca Lawson's call, Margaret sat at Daniel's old oak desk, sunlight cutting across the polished surface. The house was unusually quiet. Michael had taken Noah to school. Emily had left early, saying she had errands. Margaret no longer believed in errands. Her phone rang precisely at 9:17 a.m. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rebecca's voice was firm. "We've identified the notary." Margaret tightened her grip. "Who is it?" "A man named Charles Denning. Commissioned in Franklin County." Franklin County. Her county. Her house. Her life. Rebecca continued. "Here's the problem. Mr. Denning claims he notarized the trust in person. He states you appeared before him and presented identification." Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. "I have never seen that man in my life." "I believe you," Rebecca said. "Which means either your identity was misrepresented, or he knowingly falsified a notarization." Margaret felt the ground shift again beneath her. This was no longer family pressure. This was criminal. 2 days later, Margaret returned to Cleveland. Rebecca had arranged a formal statement interview. Margaret signed an affidavit declaring she had never met Charles Denning and had never signed the trust document. Rebecca leaned back. "There's more." Margaret braced herself. "We pulled public records. Mr. Denning has notarized over 60 estate and trust documents in the past year. And 48 of them were connected to a single real estate consulting group. Margaret felt cold. What group? Rebecca slid a printout across the desk. Midwest Legacy Property Solutions. Margaret's breath stopped. She had seen that name before. On the back of the real estate business card Emily left on the counter. The deeper Rebecca dug, the darker the pattern became. Midwest Legacy Property Solutions targeted seniors living alone, homes fully paid off, properties in desirable suburban neighborhoods. Maple Ridge Drive qualified perfectly. They positioned themselves as estate planning consultants, Rebecca explained. But several complaints have surfaced regarding aggressive trust transfers and questionable notarizations. Margaret's voice was steady now. Is Emily connected to them? Rebecca nodded slowly. She attended a financial seminar sponsored by Midwest Legacy 6 months ago in Chicago. Chicago, where the debts began. Margaret closed her eyes. This wasn't accidental. Emily hadn't simply panicked about money. She had found a system, and Margaret had been selected. That evening, Margaret waited until Michael returned from work. Sit down, she said quietly. He looked exhausted before she even spoke. She handed him copies of the investigative findings. He read silently, his face drained of color. She told me it was legal, he whispered. She told you it was easy money, Margaret replied. Michael's jaw trembled. She said if we consolidated debt through the house, we could start fresh. At my expense? He didn't answer. Margaret softened her tone. Michael, did you know the signature was forged? His silence lingered too long. Then finally, I knew she handled it. I didn't ask how. Margaret felt something inside her crack, not anger this time. Grief. Emily returned home just after 8. Margaret did not wait. She placed the evidence neatly on the dining table. The notary has been identified, Margaret said calmly. Emily froze. Michael stood beside his mother. Emily, he said, voice shaking. What did you do? Emily's composure fractured for the first time. You don't understand, she snapped. We were drowning. Credit cards, private loans, medical bills for Noah. Medical bills? Michael turned sharply. Noah's insurance covered everything. Emily faltered. Margaret watched carefully. The lie was unraveling. I meant future bills, Emily stammered. Margaret spoke softly. You attended a Midwest Legacy seminar in Chicago. Emily's eyes widened. You had no right to look into that. I had every right, Margaret replied. Michael stepped back, staring at his wife. Tell me the truth. Silence filled the room. Then Emily's shoulders dropped. They said it wasn't illegal, she whispered. They said it was estate optimization. By forging signatures? Margaret asked. They handled that part, Emily said defensively. They said seniors forget paperwork all the time. The words hung in the air like poison. Seniors forget. Margaret straightened. I do not forget. The following morning, Rebecca filed a formal complaint with the Franklin County District Attorney's Office. Franklin County District Attorney's Office. A detective was assigned. The notary, Charles Denning, was questioned. Within days, pressure mounted. Denning admitted he had notarized documents without physical presence, claiming Midwest Legacy provided pre-verified identification packets. He insisted he thought the clients had consented. The district attorney disagreed. Forgery. Fraud. Notarial misconduct. Charges were prepared. Emily began making frantic phone calls. Margaret overheard arguments in the guest bedroom. They said it was protected. Emily hissed one night. You told me it was airtight. Michael stood in the hallway afterward, pale. They're distancing themselves, he told Margaret quietly. The consulting group says she acted independently. Of course they did. Margaret felt both fury and clarity. Predators rarely stood together once exposed. A week later, Rebecca presented Margaret with options. Criminal prosecution will likely move forward against the notary and possibly Midwest Legacy. As for Emily, you can pursue separate charges for identity fraud. Margaret stared at Daniel's framed photograph on her desk. If she pressed charges, Emily could face prison. Noah would suffer. Michael's marriage would likely collapse publicly. If she didn't, the betrayal would go unpunished. The precedent would remain. Rebecca waited patiently. Margaret finally spoke. I want the trust dissolved immediately. I want full protective filings placed on my property. And I want Emily legally removed from any financial authority over my affairs. Rebecca nodded. And criminal charges? Margaret inhaled slowly. I will cooperate with the investigation. But I will not initiate additional charges against my son's wife, unless she attempts anything further. It wasn't mercy. It was boundary. Michael moved into the guest room. Emily barely left the house. Noah sensed tension and grew quiet. One evening, Noah crawled into Margaret's lap. "Grandma," he whispered, "are you mad at Mom?" Margaret swallowed her pain. "I'm disappointed," she said gently. "But I love you very much." He nodded and hugged her tighter. That hug reminded her why she had chosen restraint. 2 weeks later, Detective Harris requested a meeting. Margaret sat beside Rebecca in a quiet conference room. "We've subpoenaed financial records from Midwest Legacy," the detective said. "There's something you should know." Margaret braced herself. "You were not the only target." A list was placed on the table. 16 properties in Ohio alone. Several seniors had already lost partial ownership of their homes. Margaret's breath caught. "Some were transferred fully," the detective continued. "Some refinanced under questionable authority." Margaret felt a surge of anger unlike anything before. She had nearly become another statistic. But she hadn't. Because she questioned. Because she remembered. Because she refused to be dismissed. By early spring, subpoenas were issued. Midwest Legacy executives faced fraud investigations. Charles Denning's notary license was suspended. And Emily received official notice she may be called as a cooperating witness. Michael sat at the kitchen table, hands shaking. "They're offering her a deal," he said quietly. Margaret looked at him. "And what is she offering in return?" He swallowed. "Testimony. Against the company. Against the notary." Margaret nodded slowly. The wheel had turned. Emily was no longer in control. As night fell over Maple Ridge Drive, Margaret stood once more at the front window. The maple tree Daniel planted swayed gently in the wind. Roots matter. She had almost been uprooted. Almost. But now the storm was moving outward. And the truth was no longer buried. Spring arrived in Columbus with cold rain and gray skies. The maple tree in Margaret's front yard began to bud again, stubborn, steady, alive. Inside the house on Maple Ridge Drive, tension lived in every corner. A court date had been set. The state of Ohio versus Charles Denning and executives of Midwest Legacy Property Solutions. And Emily Whitmore was listed as a cooperating witness. The envelope arrived by certified mail. Michael signed for it. Emily stood frozen in the hallway as he handed it to her. "You have to testify," he said quietly. She opened it with trembling fingers. The courtroom would be in Cleveland, where the investigation had expanded under state jurisdiction. Margaret watched from the living room doorway. For months she had felt powerless. Now she felt something else. Stillness. Rebecca Lawson met Margaret in her office overlooking Lake Erie. "You may be called to confirm your affidavit," Rebecca explained. "The prosecution wants to establish clear victim testimony." Margaret nodded. "I will tell the truth." Rebecca studied her. "This may be difficult. The defense will argue you were confused, that you consented and later regretted it." Margaret's chin lifted. "I know my own signature." The courtroom was colder than Margaret expected. High ceilings. Dark wood benches. The state seal mounted above the judge's bench. Emily sat at the prosecution table, pale and thinner than before. Her lawyer whispered instructions beside her. Across the aisle sat Charles Denning and 2 sharply dressed executives from Midwest Legacy. Margaret felt her heart pound, but not with fear. With clarity. The judge entered. "All rise." The prosecutor from the Franklin County District Attorney's Office stood confidently. This case concerns systematic fraud targeting senior homeowners. Forged signatures. False notarizations. Illegal trust transfers. The defense countered smoothly. These were administrative errors. Miscommunications. Estate planning misunderstandings. Misunderstanding. Margaret nearly laughed. There had been nothing misunderstood about losing control of her own home. When Emily was called, the courtroom grew still. She walked slowly, avoiding Margaret's eyes. After being sworn in, she began. "At a financial seminar in Chicago, I was approached by representatives of Midwest Legacy," she said. "They promised debt consolidation through property restructuring. They said it was legal. Did you obtain Margaret Whitmore's permission to transfer her home into a trust?" the prosecutor asked. Emily hesitated. "No." "Did she sign the documents in your presence?" "No." "Was her signature genuine?" Emily's voice cracked. "No." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Truth at last spoken aloud. The defense attorney stood. "Mrs. Whitmore allowed you to manage household finances, correct?" "Yes." "And she is in her 70s? "Yes." "Is it possible she signed without remembering?" Emily swallowed. "No. She did not sign." The defense pressed harder. "You were under financial pressure, were you not?" "Yes." So you stood to benefit from this arrangement? Emily looked down. Yes. There it was. Motive. When Margaret was called, she walked carefully but steadily to the stand. She placed her hand on the Bible without hesitation. State your name. Margaret and Whitmore. Did you sign the trust document dated November 14th? I did not. The prosecutor displayed enlarged copies of the signature. Is this your handwriting? Margaret leaned forward. No. The loop on the M is incorrect. My husband always teased me about that loop. I have written it the same way for 50 years. A faint smile touched her lips at the memory. The prosecutor nodded. Did you authorize anyone to sign on your behalf? No. Did you consent to placing your home into a shared trust with survivorship rights? Absolutely not. Her voice echoed clearly in the courtroom. Financial records were presented. Email communications from Midwest Legacy executives encouraging accelerated sign-off. Training materials describing minimal resistance scenarios. One internal message read, "Most seniors won't challenge paperwork if family is aligned." Margaret felt a chill. They had counted on her silence. Michael was called unexpectedly. He looked exhausted, older. Did you know the signature was forged? The prosecutor asked. Michael's throat tightened. I suspected the paperwork moved faster than it should have. Did you intervene? No. Why not? He glanced toward Emily. I was afraid of losing everything. The prosecutor's voice softened. And what did you nearly lose? Michael's eyes filled. My mother. The courtroom went silent. Margaret looked at her son, truly looked at him. For the first time in months, she saw not betrayal, but weakness and regret. After 3 days of testimony, the jury deliberated. The wait felt endless. Margaret sat beside Rebecca, hands folded. Finally, the jury returned. On the count of fraud and conspiracy to commit property theft, guilty. Charles Denning lowered his head. The Midwest Legacy executives showed no expression. Sentencing would follow. Restitution funds were ordered for affected homeowners. The fraudulent trust was permanently voided. Margaret's home was legally reaffirmed in her sole name. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Margaret declined interviews. She did not want fame. She wanted peace. Emily stood alone near the steps. She approached slowly. I never meant to hurt you, she said quietly. Margaret studied her carefully. Intent does not erase action. Emily nodded, tears forming. I'm cooperating fully. They may reduce charges. That is between you and the law, Margaret replied calmly. Then she added, softer. I hope you learn from this. Emily lowered her eyes. On the drive back to Columbus, Michael sat in the passenger seat of Margaret's car. For once, he did not speak first. I should have protected you, he finally said. Margaret kept her eyes on the road. Yes, she replied. Silence stretched. But you are still my son, she added. His shoulders shook quietly. When Margaret stepped back inside the white colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive, she paused in the entryway. The walls felt steady again. The air lighter. Daniel's mug sat safely on the kitchen shelf where it belonged. Roots matter. And this house was still rooted. 2 weeks later, Michael made a decision. He and Emily would separate. She would move back to Chicago temporarily while cooperating with ongoing investigations. Noah would remain in Columbus with shared custody. Margaret did not celebrate. This was not victory. It was consequence. But she did one thing differently now. She met with Rebecca and updated her estate plan properly. A clear will, a secure trust of her own choosing, and strict protective clauses. Not because she feared her son, but because clarity prevents exploitation. As summer approached, Margaret planted fresh flowers along the front porch. Neighbors waved more warmly now. Some had quietly followed the news. One afternoon, a letter arrived from another elderly homeowner who had been saved by the investigation. Because you spoke up, it read. I checked my paperwork too. Margaret folded the letter carefully. Her voice had mattered. Her memory had mattered. Her refusal had mattered. The maple tree outside swayed in warm wind. Strong roots. Still standing. Summer came gently to Columbus. The maple tree in Margaret Whitmore's yard was full again, green, steady, unapologetically alive. The house on Maple Ridge Drive no longer felt tense. It felt older. Wiser. Like Margaret herself. Emily had moved back to Chicago temporarily as part of her cooperation agreement. Criminal charges against the Midwest Legacy executives moved forward. Charles Denning's sentencing made local headlines. But Maple Ridge Drive grew quiet again. Michael moved into the smaller guest room permanently. He insisted on paying rent now, something Margaret had never required before. It's only fair, he said. Margaret accepted. Not because she needed the money, but because responsibility had finally taken root in him. 8-year-old Noah noticed everything. One evening, as fireflies blinked across the yard, he sat beside Margaret on the porch. "Grandma," he asked softly, "why did everyone go to court?" Margaret considered her answer carefully. "Because sometimes people make wrong choices," she said. "And when they do, we have to fix them honestly." "Was Mom bad?" Margaret felt the weight of that question. "No," she replied gently. "She made bad decisions. That's different." Noah nodded slowly, absorbing more than most adults could. "Will she come back?" "She will visit," Margaret said. "But grown-ups have to work on their mistakes first." Noah leaned against her shoulder. "Grandma?" "Yes. I'm glad you didn't forget." Margaret's breath caught. Neither am I, she thought. Michael began attending financial counseling sessions. He sold his expensive SUV. He canceled credit cards. One afternoon, he sat across from Margaret at Daniel's old oak desk. "I was ashamed," he admitted. "I thought if we fixed the debt quietly, no one would know." Margaret folded her hands. "Shame grows in silence," she said. "Honesty stops it." He looked around the room. "I almost lost this house." "Yes," Margaret said softly. "You almost did. But you didn't let me." Margaret met his eyes. "I didn't let anyone." Late that summer, Margaret made a choice. Not out of fear. Not out of anger. But out of clarity. She invited Rebecca Lawson from Cleveland to visit Maple Ridge Drive personally. They sat at the dining table. The same table where trust papers had once been laid without permission. This time, everything was transparent. "I've been thinking about legacy," Margaret said. Rebecca nodded. "Go on." "I don't want this house to become a burden. Or a temptation." She outlined her plan. The house would remain hers for life. After her passing, it would transfer into a legally protected family trust. Michael would receive residency rights, not ownership. Ownership would pass directly to Noah when he turned 30. If the property were ever sold, a portion of proceeds would fund a local senior legal aid organization. Rebecca smiled slightly. "That's thoughtful." "It's protective," Margaret corrected gently. "Roots matter. But so do boundaries." In early autumn, Emily returned to Columbus for a supervised visit. She looked different, less polished, more human. She asked to speak with Margaret privately. They stood beneath the maple tree. "I was greedy," Emily said quietly. "Not just for money, for security, for control." Margaret studied her carefully. "Why control?" she asked. Emily's voice trembled. "I grew up unstable. We moved constantly. My parents lost houses twice. I promised myself I would never be powerless again." Margaret absorbed that. Pain explained behavior. It did not excuse it. "I hope you learn healthier ways to feel secure," Margaret said calmly. Emily nodded, tears forming. "I'm sorry." Margaret paused. Then she said something neither of them expected. "I forgive you." Not because Emily deserved it, but because Margaret refused to carry bitterness into her remaining years. Forgiveness was freedom. Trust, however, would take much longer. News of the case spread across Ohio. Margaret was invited to speak at a senior awareness seminar in Cincinnati. She stood at the podium, hands steady. "I am not here because I am extraordinary," she told the audience. "I am here because I asked questions." She described, checking signatures carefully, speaking directly to banks, never surrendering documents without clarity, trusting instinct. "Age does not mean incapacity," she concluded. "And love does not require surrender." The room erupted in applause. Years passed. Noah grew taller. His voice deepened. He learned about integrity not from lectures, but from watching his grandmother stand firm. Michael rebuilt his finances slowly, honestly. Emily remained involved in Noah's life, but never again touched property decisions. Margaret aged gracefully, stubbornly. One winter evening, snow fell softly across Maple Ridge Drive. Margaret sat in her favorite chair, Daniel's mug warm in her hands. Michael sat nearby reading. Noah, now a teenager, worked on homework at the dining table. The house felt alive again. Not because conflict had happened, but because truth had survived it. Margaret looked at her son. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. His eyes filled. "I learned from you." She looked at Noah. "And you," she said gently. "Remember, this house is not just walls. It is responsibility." He nodded solemnly. When Margaret eventually passed, peacefully years later, the legal structure she built worked exactly as designed. No confusion. No manipulation. No exploitation. The home remained in the family, protected, structured, respected. A portion of funds from a later refinancing supported senior legal aid programs across Ohio. And on Maple Ridge Drive, the maple tree continued to grow. Strong roots, deep foundation, clear boundaries, love without surrender.